My brother and I graduated from college together, but my parents only paid for my brother's tuition. He has potential. You don't, they said. 4 years later, they came to our graduation, and when the dean called my name as valedictorian, Mom grabbed Dad's arm and whispered, "Harold, what did we do?" But that moment of vindication hadn't happened yet. Back then, I was just 18, standing on a beige carpet that smelled of stale potpourri, watching my father destroy my future with the casual indifference of someone canceling a magazine subscription. The acceptance letters sat on the mahogany coffee table like two loaded guns waiting to go off. Ryan and I had both gotten into Stratford University, a miracle of probability that should have been cause for a massive celebration. Instead, the air in the living room was thick enough to choke on. Ryan was practically vibrating, already texting his friends about frat row parties and football season tickets. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded tightly in my lap to hide the tremors, staring at the tuition breakdown printed on the creamy letterhead. Dad settled into his leather armchair, the one we were never allowed to touch, and cleared his throat loudly. He didn't look like a father addressing his twin sons. He looked like a CEO handling a difficult merger with a failing subsidiary. Mom sat on the sofa next to Ryan, her hand resting protectively on his knee, her eyes fixed on the floor. She knew what was coming. I realized then that they had rehearsed this. The silence stretched until the grandfather clock in the hall ticked past the minute mark. "We need to talk about finances," Dad began, his voice devoid of any warmth. He picked up Ryan's letter first, tapping it rhythmically against his palm. "Ryan is going to Stratford. We've set aside the full amount for his tuition, room and board." Ryan whooped, pumping a fist, but Dad raised a sharp hand to silence him. Then he turned to me. He didn't pick up my letter. He just looked at me with cold, flat eyes. "Jeremy, we simply cannot leverage the capital for 2 tuitions. We have to choose." The implied choice hung in the air, transforming me from a son into a failed stock option. "Ryan has charisma," Dad continued, ticking points off his fingers like an accountant. "He builds networks. He has leadership qualities. That is where the money goes." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, closing the deal. "You're smart, Jeremy, but you're quiet. There is no return on investment with you." The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was the clinical assessment of my worth. I looked at Mom, silently begging her to intervene. Mom turned her head away, studying the floral pattern on the curtains like it was fascinating. That small movement hurt more than Dad's words ever could. It was the confirmation of my total insolvency in this family. I stood up, leaving my acceptance letter on the table. "I understand," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'll figure it out." Dad nodded, relieved the business was concluded. "Good. It's time you learned the value of $1. He didn't know he had just taught me the price of my own freedom. 4:30 a.m. wasn't a time, it was a physical assault. My roommate, a finance major named Greg, snored through the noise that governed my life. I slid out of bed, feet hitting the cold linoleum, and pulled on my bakery uniform. It smelled faintly of yeast and industrial sanitizer. My hands were already raw from yesterday's dishwashing shift, the skin cracked and red. There was no time for coffee. I had to be at the dough mixer by 5 or I was fired. The campus was a graveyard at dawn. I walked past the fraternity houses where the lawn sprinklers were the only things moving. While the investments slept off their hangovers, I was calculating my survival in 15-minute increments. DOF rising. Lecture notes, shift change, bleach buckets. I had become a master of time management because I had no other currency. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. I was running a marathon at a sprinter's pace, and my body was starting to fail. That night I traded the flour for a mop. I was assigned to the 3rd floor of Ryan's dorm, a cruelty of the scheduling algorithm that felt intentional. The hallway smelled of stale beer and Axe body spray. I was scrubbing a particularly stubborn scuff mark near the elevator when the doors dinged open. Ryan stumbled out, supported by 2 guys in polo shirts. He looked wrecked, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He didn't even recognize the guy in the gray jumpsuit. "Dude, watch out for the janitor," one friend slurred, steering Ryan around my wet floor sign. Ryan blinked, a flicker of recognition passing through the haze, but he didn't stop. "My life is over," Ryan moaned loud enough to echo. "That B- in econ is going to kill my GPA. Dad is going to cut my allowance." I gripped the mop handle until the wood creaked. He was drowning in a puddle. I was treading water in the ocean. I finished the shift at 2 a.m. and checked my student portal on my phone. The red banner across the top of the screen made my stomach drop. The spring tuition installment was due in 48 hours. Despite the bakery, the cleaning, and the tutoring on weekends, the math remained stubborn. I was exactly $8,000 short. The bursar's office was clear pay in full or get purged from the roster. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through my exhaustion. I opened my banking app, hoping for a miracle, but opened Venmo by mistake. The feed refreshed automatically. There, right at the top, was a transaction from 20 minutes ago. Mom's profile picture smiled back at me. She had sent a payment to Ryan. The caption read, "For emergency supplies! Love you." The emojis were snowflakes and skiers. I clicked the details. The amount wasn't for books. It was for a luxury spring break trip to Aspen. The number on the screen mocked me. $8,000. The exact amount I needed to stay in school was funding my brother's lift tickets and apres-ski drinks. I stared at the phone until the screen blurred. They weren't just refusing to help me. They were funding his mediocrity with the lifeline I needed to survive. The sadness that had dogged me for months evaporated, replaced by a cold clarity. I didn't need their money. I needed to take what nobody else wanted. Professor Vance didn't teach economics, he dismantled egos for sport. He threw a stack of case studies onto his desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the silent lecture hall. Market volatility in post-war reconstruction. He barked, scanning the room with predatory eyes. Analyze the trends. Predict the failure points, due in 48 hours. The class groaned collectively, but I felt a strange thrill. This was my chance. Beside me, Ryan was already texting his tutor, a guy named Kyle who charged $50 a page. The next 2 days were a blur of caffeine and blue light. I sat in the 24-hour library basement, surrounded by stacks of reference books that smelled of dust and old glue. While Ryan was presumably packing his designer ski gear for Aspen, I was building a predictive model from scratch. My eyes burned, and my hands shook from lack of sleep, but the data was singing to me. I wasn't just doing homework, I was proving I existed. I turned it in online with 1 minute to spare. Tuesday morning brought the summons. An email from Vance's teaching assistant appeared on my phone during my shift at the bakery. See Professor Vance immediately. Office 304. My stomach dropped into my shoes. Had I miscited a source? Had I interpreted the data wrong? I wiped the dried flour from my hands and changed into my only collared shirt, which was fraying at the cuffs. Walking to the economics building felt like marching to the gallows. I knocked on the frosted glass door, preparing to be expelled. Vance was staring out the window at the quad when I entered. He didn't turn around. My papers sat on his desk, marked up with so much red ink it looked like a crime scene. "Sit," he commanded. I sat on the edge of the stiff wooden chair. He finally turned, picking up my analysis. "Tell me, mister." He glanced at the cover page. "Jeremy, did you have help with this? A tutor? A study group?" His voice was unrateable, razor sharp and quiet. "No, sir," I said, my voice tight. I couldn't afford a tutor. I braced for the accusation of plagiarism. I used the raw data from the Federal Archives. "The models are mine." Vance stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, dissecting me like a specimen. Then he tossed the paper back onto the desk. "I know," he said, a small smile touching his lips, "because no one else in this university is hungry enough to dig this deep. This is doctoral-level work, son." The relief nearly knocked me over. Vance leaned forward, clasping his hands. "I run the committee for the Sterling Fellowship. It's a full tuition grant, plus a monthly stipend for living expenses." My heart hammered against my ribs. It sounded like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "But there are conditions," he warned, his expression hardening again. "You maintain a 4.0 GPA. You work as my research assistant. And you quit those damn jobs that are making you look like a walking corpse." "I'll do it," I said instantly. The bakery, the cleaning, the exhaustion. It could all end today. Vance nodded, pulling a contract from his drawer. He slid it across the mahogany surface. "One last thing," he added casually, uncapping a fountain pen. "The Sterling Fellow is traditionally the class valedictorian. You'll be expected to deliver the commencement address at graduation." I signed the paper without hesitation. I didn't care about a speech. I just wanted to survive. I had no idea I had just signed my parents' warrant. The first deposit from the Sterling Fellowship hit my account like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I stared at the balance on my phone screen, the numbers looking foreign compared to the single digits I was used to. I quit the bakery that afternoon. Handing in my apron felt like shedding a layer of dead skin. I moved out of the cramped dorm room and into a studio apartment 3 blocks from campus. It wasn't a palace, just 4 white walls and a window overlooking an alley. But it was silent. For the first time in 2 years, I slept until the sun came up. Silence became my new addiction. While Ryan was posting stories of keg stands and tailgate parties on Instagram, I was dissecting fiscal policies in Vance's private study. The work was grueling, but it was clean. I wasn't scrubbing floors or kneading dough. I was building a reputation. My name started appearing as a co-author on academic journals, buried in footnotes that my parents would never read. I was becoming a ghost in my own family, fading from their reality while solidifying my own. I preferred it that way. Invisibility was a shield. Thanksgiving came and went without a plane ticket. I stayed in the city, ordering Chinese takeout and working on my thesis proposal. My phone buzzed occasionally with group texts from Mom. Photos of the turkey, the table set for 3, Ryan smiling with a beer in his hand. They didn't ask why I wasn't there. They assumed I was working some minimum wage job to scrape by. The distance wasn't a punishment anymore, it was a boundary. I zoomed in on the photo. Ryan looked tired, his smile straining at the edges. The investment was starting to depreciate. Winter break revealed the truth behind the curated photos. Ryan sent me a DM at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. "You still a nerd? Lol." It was followed by a blurry picture of a bar tab that cost more than my old monthly rent. He was spiraling, masking the academic pressure with expensive distractions funded by Dad's wire transfers. I didn't reply. I just turned my phone over and went back to my research. I was building a future. He was burning through his. The gap between us was no longer just financial. It was existential. By the start of senior year, I was effectively running Vance's upper-level seminar. I graded papers, led discussions, and held office hours for students who didn't know I was the same age as them. I wore a tailored suit I bought with my stipend, not to show off, but to fit the part. Walking across the quad, I felt like a spy in enemy territory. Students waved at me with respect, unaware I was the bad investment. I was winning a game my parents didn't even know I was playing. Then the silence broke. I was in the library outlining my final dissertation chapter when an email notification slid down my screen. The sender was Harold J. Miller, my father. I froze, my cursor blinking rhythmically on the blank page. He hadn't emailed me directly since the tuition rejection letter. My heart hammered a warning rhythm against my ribs. I expected a reprimand, a demand for money, or maybe, foolishly, an apology. I clicked the subject line, "Regarding your brother." It wasn't about me at all. The body of the email was brief and transactional. "Jeremy, Ryan is struggling with his macroeconomics requisites. He mentioned you were still on campus. Send him your notes. We need to ensure he stays on track for the firm." "No, how are you?" "No, good luck." Just a directive to service their primary asset. I looked at the screen, reading the words until they blurred into nonsense. They wanted me to drag him across the finish line. I hit the delete button, watching the email vanish into the digital void. 2 weeks before graduation, the dean summoned me to the administration tower. The carpet was plush enough to swallow my footsteps, a stark contrast to the linoleum floors of the bakery I used to scrub. Professor Vance stood by the window, looking grimly satisfied. The dean didn't mince words, handing me a heavy cream envelope embossed with a gold seal. "You are the top of the class, Jeremy. The Sterling Fellow always speaks." I held the envelope, feeling its texture. It wasn't just an award, it was a detonation device. Writing the speech was harder than the dissertation. I sat in my studio, the cursor blinking on the screen like a rhythmic taunt. I couldn't be angry. Anger was messy and unprofessional. I needed to be cold, precise, and undeniably successful. I typed drafts that sounded too corporate, then drafts that sounded too wounded. Finally, I settled on the simple truth. The theme wasn't success, it was value. I printed the final copy on heavy bond paper, locking it in my desk drawer. It was ready. The logistics of the ceremony began to circulate, confirming the inevitable collision. My phone buzzed with a notification from the university's guest portal, which Vance had given me access to. Harold and Diane Miller have reserved 2 tickets. They were coming. For 4 years, they hadn't visited the campus once. Now they were flying in, booking the expensive hotel downtown, and preparing their cameras. They weren't coming to see their son graduate. They were coming to inspect their product. They had no idea they had bought a ticket to the wrong show. A forwarded email from an aunt confirmed the rest of the details. Mom had booked a table at Le Jardin, the most expensive French restaurant in the city, to celebrate. The reservation was for 7 p.m., party of 3. I stared at the number until it burned into my retinas. 3, Mom, Dad, and Ryan. Even on graduation night, I didn't have a seat at the table. The exclusion didn't sting like it used to. It just solidified my resolve. They had already erased me. I ran into Ryan outside the student union 3 days later. He didn't look like the golden boy anymore. His skin was sallow, and there were dark circles carved deep under his eyes. He was holding a venti coffee with a shaking hand. When he saw me, he flinched, as if he'd seen a ghost. "Jeer," he mumbled, his voice raspy. "You are still here. I thought you transferred to community college." He didn't ask how I was. He was too consumed by his own panic. We stood awkwardly on the concrete path, the spring wind whipping around us. Ryan looked over his shoulder, paranoid. "Dad's coming," he whispered, wiping sweat from his upper lip. "He thinks I am graduating cum laude. I barely passed my electives, man." He laughed, but it sounded like a choke. "If I don't get that job at his firm, he's going to kill me." The fear in his eyes was genuine. He wasn't the favorite anymore. He was a liability in terrified denial. "Good luck, Ryan," I said, stepping around him. He grabbed my arm, his grip weak and desperate. "Are you coming to the ceremony? You could sit in the overflow section. Mom might like to see you." The pity in his voice was nauseating. He genuinely thought I was a failure, a spectator in his life. I looked at his hand on my sleeve until he let go. "I'll be there," I promised. "I have a very good seat." He nodded, oblivious to the storm approaching. The stadium was a cauldron of noise and polyester heat. 3,000 graduates sat in black robes, sweating under the harsh lights. I sat in the front row of the honors section, separated from the general population by a velvet rope and 4 years of isolation. From my vantage point, I scanned the guest seating. It didn't take long to find them. Dad was wearing his deal-closing navy suit, and Mom had on a cream hat. They looked perfectly ignorantly happy. They were waiting for a show, unaware they were the punchline. Dad held a DSLR camera with a lens long enough to shoot a safari, checking the settings with obsessive fussiness. He scanned the middle rows of the general seating, hunting for Ryan. Beside him, Mom dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, performing pride for an audience of strangers. They leaned in to whisper, likely commenting on the tuition costs or the lack of air conditioning. They exuded the confidence of investors about to cash out. It made my stomach tighten with cold anticipation. I adjusted the gold sash draped across my chest. The ceremony droned on, a slow march of names and handshakes. When they reached the M's, Dad raised the camera. "Ryan Miller," the announcer read, his voice flat. Ryan shuffled across the stage, looking small in a gown that seemed too big. There were no honors cords, just the plain fabric of the bare minimum. He took his diploma cover and vanished. Dad lowered the camera slowly, frowning. He checked the display screen, clearly disappointed that the moment was so brief. He looked bored, checking his watch for the dinner reservation. The applause faded into a restless murmur as the dean stepped up to the microphone. The air shifted instantly. Professor Vance stood behind him, looking directly at me with a nod of encouragement. "It is my distinct privilege," the dean boomed, his voice echoing off the concrete, "to introduce our valedictorian." He paused for effect. A recipient of the Starling Fellowship and a scholar of exceptional merit. The crowd quieted. In the stands, Dad was packing his camera away. He wasn't even looking at the stage anymore. "Please welcome," the dean continued, his voice rising, "Mr. Jeremy Miller." The name hung in the air for a split second before the stadium erupted. I stood up from the front row, the movement feeling mechanical. The massive jumbotron above the field cut from the podium to my face. I was 10 feet tall in high definition, wearing the gold sash and the medal of the fellowship. I walked toward the stairs. The sound was deafening, a physical wave, but but my focus narrowed to a single point. I glanced at the third row of the stands as I climbed the steps. The reaction was visceral. Mom froze mid-clap, her hands suspended like a broken animatronic. Her eyes went wide, darting from the screen to the stage. She grabbed Dad's arm, fingers digging into his expensive suit. I saw her lips move, forming the words that would haunt them forever. "Harold, what did we do?" The color drained from my father's face. He looked as if he had been struck by a physical blow. Reaching the podium felt like summiting a mountain I had climbed without oxygen. I smoothed my notes on the lectern, the paper crisp under my fingers. The microphone smelled of metal and nervous sweat. I looked out at the sea of faces, thousands of strangers who knew nothing of my war. But right in the center, two faces were paralyzed in horror and confusion. They looked small now. The giants who had controlled my world were just terrified people in folding chairs. I took a deep breath. I leaned into the microphone, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. I locked eyes with my father. He didn't look away, he couldn't. He stared at me with the expression of a man watching his house burn down, realizing he had locked the doors himself. I saw the gears turning, the math being redone in his head. The bad investment was standing at the pinnacle of the institution he idolized. I held his gaze. This was the only apology I was ever going to get. We are often told that our value is determined by others. I began, my voice steady and amplified. That we are investments to be managed, assets to be projected. I didn't shout, I didn't need to. The acoustics carried every syllable. But I learned that when the world refuses to invest in you, you must double down on yourself. I spoke about the early mornings and the late nights, omitting the anger but keeping the grit. It wasn't a speech about success, it was about survival. I finished with a simple truth. The only approval that matters is the one you see in the mirror. The stadium exploded again, students throwing caps, parents cheering. I stepped back, clutching my diploma. I looked at my parents one last time. They weren't cheering. They were sitting in a pocket of absolute silence, surrounded by celebration, looking like they had just attended a funeral. I turned my back on them and walked off the stage. I was finally completely free. The debt was paid in full. The reception tent was a white canvas cathedral erected on the manicured lawn. Waiters circulated with champagne flutes that caught the late afternoon sun. I stood near the faculty entrance, accepting handshakes from department heads who treated me like a colleague rather than a student. I saw them before they saw me. My parents were cutting through the crowd, ignoring the celebration around them. They moved with a frantic energy, pushing past a group of cheering engineering students. They weren't coming to celebrate, they were coming to salvage their damaged ego. Dad reached me first, his face flushed a blotchy red that clashed with his silk tie. He looked out of breath, stripped of his usual boardroom composure. Mom was right behind him, clutching her purse like a shield, her mascara already smudged. They stopped 2 feet away, invading my personal space. The air between us crackled with unsaid things. "Jeremy," Dad said, breathless. He reached out a hand, instinctively trying to bridge the gap he had dug himself. I didn't take it. I just took a sip of water. That was quite a speech. Dad managed, dropping his hand awkwardly to his side. He forced a smile that looked painful, a rictus of panic. "We had no idea, son." "Why didn't you tell us?" The audacity of the question almost made me laugh. He was trying to rewrite history in real time, pretending 4 years of silence was a mutual administrative error. "I didn't think it was relevant," I said, my voice cool. "You were very clear about your portfolio management. I didn't want to confuse the data." Mom stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on my arm. Her perfume was the same expensive floral scent she wore to country club dinners, a smell that used to mean safety but now just smelled like money. "Jeremy, please," she whispered, her voice thick with performative grief. "We did what we thought was right. We had to make hard choices." She looked around, checking if anyone was watching her performance. "We love you both. You have to know that." It was a lie so practiced it almost sounded true. I gently removed her hand from my sleeve, stepping back to re-establish the boundary. "Love isn't a line item, Mom," I said softly. Dad cleared his throat, eager to pivot to ground he understood. "Business. Look, let's put this behind us," he said, straightening his jacket. "The firm is looking for fresh associates. I can make a call. We can fast-track you. Starting salary is competitive. He was trying to buy me back. He thought I was still the desperate kid begging for a tuition check. I took a slow breath, savoring the moment. "I appreciate the offer, Harold," I said, using his first name intentionally. He flinched. "But I've already accepted a position." I named the competitor, a global firm that ate companies like his for breakfast. "I start Monday. The signing bonus alone covers my student loans." Dad's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The numbers were undeniable. I wasn't just successful, I was out of his league. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had evaporated. Ryan drifted up to the edge of our circle, holding a half-empty champagne glass. He looked at Dad, then at me, and I saw something unexpected in his eyes. Relief. He realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the disappointment. I was the threat. "Congrats, jeer," he mumbled, saluting me with the glass. "You really showed them." It was the most honest thing he had said in years. He wasn't angry that I won. He was just glad he didn't have to compete anymore. I turned back to my parents. They looked small, diminished by the realization that they had nothing left to offer me. "I don't want your job," I told them, keeping my voice low so only they could hear. "I don't want your money, and I certainly don't want your validation." Dad looked at his shoes, defeated. "I was an investment, remember?" I reminded him, twisting the knife one last time. "You cut your losses. You don't get to claim the dividends now that the stock went up." Mom started to cry in earnest now, ugly gasping sobs that drew stares from the nearby families. "But we're your family," she pleaded, grasping at straws. "You can't just walk away." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing. The anger was gone, replaced by a vast, cool indifference. "I walked away 4 years ago," I said. "You just didn't notice until today." I set my water glass on a passing waiter's tray. It was time to close the account. "Goodbye, Mom." "Goodbye, Harold," I said, turning on my heel. I walked toward the exit of the tent, where the evening sun was turning the sky a brilliant, burning gold. I could hear Mom calling my name, but her voice sounded faint, like it was coming from underwater. I didn't slow down. I walked past the open bar, past the cheering graduates, and out onto the street. The air tasted sweet and sharp. I hailed a cab, got in, and didn't look back at the rearview mirror. 5 years later, the silence in my life costs a fortune to maintain. My apartment overlooks Central Park, a glass box of quiet far above the street noise. I poured a cup of coffee from a machine that cost more than my first car. It wasn't about the luxury, though. It was about the absolute control I now held over my environment. I stood by the floor, took ceiling window, watching the city wake up. My phone buzzed on the marble island, vibrating against the stone. Underneath a notification for a pending acquisition deal was a voicemail from an unlisted number. I pressed play, letting the speakerphone break the morning calm. Ryan's voice filled the kitchen, sounding older and strangely humbled. "Hey, Jer, just thought I'd let you know. Mom and Dad sold the house. They're downsizing to a condo in Florida." He paused, the sound of traffic in the background suggesting a commute he hated. "Dad got forced into early retirement. The firm pushed him out. Irony, right?" He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Ryan was working mid-level sales now, grinding in a way he never expected. The golden child had rusted. I listened to the message end without smiling. There was no surge of vindictive joy, just a quiet verification of physics, action and reaction. Dad had bet everything on image and lost the substance. I deleted the voicemail without saving it. I didn't need their failure to validate my success anymore. That hunger had died on the graduation stage. I picked up my tablet to check the morning markets. My portfolio was up 3%. I had built an empire out of the scraps they threw away. The rejection hadn't broken me, it had streamlined me. Later that afternoon, I sat in my office with the university alumni director. He was pitching a naming opportunity for the new economics wing. I slid a check across the polished oak desk. The number made his eyebrows shoot up into his hairline. "This is incredibly generous, Mr. Miller," he stammered, staring at the zeros. "We can name the library after your family, the Harold and Diane Miller Hall." I shook my head, capping my pen with a satisfying click. "No, I have a specific name in mind for this scholarship fund. Call it the Bad Investment Initiative," I said, watching his confusion. "It's for students with high potential and zero family support." The director blinked, unsure if I was joking. I wanted to go to the kids who are working the graveyard shift at the bakery. I clarified. The ones scrubbing floors to pay for books. He nodded slowly, sensing the heavy history behind the request. It was petty, maybe, but it was also poetic. I was turning their insult into someone else's ladder. It was the only way to make the pain profitable. That evening, I walked home through the park, the check already clearing in the system. I thought about Dad sitting in a small condo in Florida, wondering where his return on investment went. He would never understand that he had given me the greatest gift of all. By refusing to help me, he forced me to become undeniable. I stopped at a crosswalk, looking up at the lights of the city I had conquered. I wasn't waiting for an inheritance or an apology. I was my own dividend, and the yield was higher than they could ever imagine.